Thank you for being here. Welcome to Chill Sports History. I'm very glad you've joined me for this one. Maybe you're listening while doing something else, maybe you're winding down for the night, or maybe you just want a quiet story to have on in the background for a little while. However you found your way here, I hope this can be a calm place to settle in for a bit. This time we're going back to the spring of 2004 and to one of the most unforgettable almost championships in hockey history. It's the story of the Calgary Flames, a team that wasn't supposed to get this far, a team that had missed the playoffs for years, and a team that slowly turned itself into something very hard to push aside. By the end of that season, they were one win from the Stanley Cup. More than that, they were one moment from it. One bounce, one crease scramble, one puck near a goal line that people in Calgary still talk about as if it happened yesterday. Because this is not just the story of a good playoff run that came up short. It's the story of a team that climbed past one favorite after another, carried a whole city with it, and then reached a finish line that still does not feel fully settled. It's a story with a strange kind of ache to it. Not the ache of a simple defeat, but the ache of something that seemed to happen, and yet somehow did not count. And so tonight, or today, whenever you're listening, we're going to take our time with it. We're going to look back at who the Flames were before that run began, how they found their identity, how they pushed all the way through the Western Conference, and how they came so close to winning the Stanley Cup that many people still believe they did, at least for a moment, before the game and the season slipped away. This is the story of the 2004 Calgary Flames and how they came within inches of a championship. Before that spring, the Flames were not a glamorous team, and they were not a trendy pick. Calgary had missed the playoffs every year since 1996. There were good players on the roster, and there were reasons to think the team was improving, but there was very little around the league that suggested this would become one of the defining playoff runs of the era. The biggest star was Jarome Iginla, already one of the league's most respected players. He could score, he could lead, he could fight if he needed to, and he carried himself with the kind of strength that seemed to settle a whole bench. But one great player is not enough on its own, especially in the kind of Western Conference that existed at the time. The West was heavy, deep, and difficult. Teams like Detroit, Vancouver, and San Jose looked more naturally built for long playoff runs. Calgary looked more like a team that might be annoying to play against than a team that might actually come out of the conference. But that was part of what made this group dangerous. They did not need to look impressive in the usual way. They did not need to move like a machine built for style points. They only needed to become difficult, then more difficult than that, and then difficult enough that better-known teams started to crack first. A big part of that came from Daryl Sutter. Behind the bench, and increasingly in control of the team's overall direction, Sutter gave the Flames a very clear identity. Calgary was going to play a direct, structured, hard-edged game. They were not going to try to entertain the league. They were going to wear teams down. They were going to stay inside games. They were going to make games feel narrow and heavy and uncomfortable. And if the score stayed close deep into the third period, Calgary was usually fine with that. In fact, Calgary preferred it. The regular season did not make the Flames look dominant, but it did make them look real. They finished with 94 points, which was enough for 6th place in the Western Conference. That alone was already meaningful. It ended the long playoff drought and gave the city something it had not had in years. But even then, the larger story still did not seem obvious. Plenty of teams break a drought and lose in the first round. Plenty of good stories last a week. Calgary's story was still only beginning. One of the most important changes came in goal. Early in the season, the Flames made a trade with San Jose for Miikka Kiprusoff. At the time, it did not feel like the kind of move that would reshape an entire year. Kiprusoff was talented, but he was not yet a major star. By the time the season settled in, though, he had become exactly the kind of goaltender this team needed. Calm, quiet, efficient. He did not seem to waste movement or emotion. He just kept the puck out. That changed everything for Calgary. Once the Flames believed they had that level of security in net, the rest of the roster could lean further into the kind of hockey it was already built to play. They did not need to chase open games. They did not need to panic after one mistake. They could defend, forecheck, lean on people, wait for openings, and trust that if they scored 2 goals, that might be enough. And often, it was.
Iginla finished with 41 goals and shared the Rocket Richard Trophy.
Craig Conroy was steady and smart beside him. Defensively, Robin Regeer gave the team bite and force. Jordan Leopold could move the puck.
Martin Jelena brought experience and timing.
Chris Simon brought edge. Sean Donovan brought speed. Stefan Yell and Dean McCammond helped make Calgary difficult to play against even when the top scorers were not on the ice. It was a team with a lot of moving parts, but once it clicked into place, it made a kind of sense that felt stronger than the individual names. Calgary did not look like the most talented team in hockey. It looked like a team that knew exactly what it was, and that matters in playoff stories. Sometimes the teams that go deepest are not the teams with the most dazzling roster cards. Sometimes they are the teams with the clearest identity. Calgary had one. Every game seemed to ask the same question of the opponent. Can you stay patient? Can you stay comfortable? Can you win this kind of game? A lot of teams eventually found that they could not. The Flames opened the playoffs against the Vancouver Canucks, and right away the series felt tense and alive. Vancouver was the higher seed and had more outside confidence behind it. Calgary lost the first game, but the series never really settled into anything comfortable for the Canucks. The Flames kept pulling it toward their kind of hockey. They hit, they clogged space, they refused to go away. The series became even more dramatic in Game 6. Vancouver built a 4-0 lead, and it looked for all the world as though Calgary's run was about to end right there. But the Flames came all the way back and tied the game. They eventually lost in triple overtime, which made the comeback feel almost cruel, but that night still revealed something important. This team did not break easily. It did not spook. It did not disappear just because the game tilted against it. Then came Game 7 in Vancouver. The game itself became one of those early round classics that can change the emotional shape of an entire playoff run. Calgary led. Vancouver answered. Late in regulation, with the Flames ahead 2-1 and only a few seconds left, Matt Cook tied it for the Canucks. That kind of goal usually feels fatal for the team that gives it up. A team can carry that kind of shock into overtime and lose before it ever fully settles down. Calgary did not.
Just 1 minute and 25 seconds into overtime, Martin Jelena scored on the power play, and suddenly the Flames were moving on.
It was Calgary's first playoff series win since the Stanley Cup season in 1989, and it announced the team to the rest of the league in a way the regular season never really had. This was no longer a nice return to relevance. This was an actual threat.
And Jelena had begun to build his own place in the story.
He was not the face of the team.
That was clearly Iginla.
He was not the revelation in goal. That was Kiprusoff. But playoff runs always seem to produce one player like this, someone whose timing becomes almost eerie, someone who appears again and again at the edge of the biggest moments.
Jelena was becoming that player for Calgary.
The second round brought the Detroit Red Wings, which only made Calgary's path seem more difficult. Detroit was full of stars and fully expected to make a run of its own. But once again, the Flames took the series into a place where reputation mattered less than nerve and structure. Game by game, they dragged Detroit into these narrow, exhausting contests. Calgary stole Game 1 in overtime. Detroit won Game 2. The series tightened. Then the Flames won Game 5 by a score of 1-0, with Kiprusoff turning aside everything that came his way. That gave Calgary a chance to close the series at home in Game 6.
And the ending, once again, belonged to Jelena.
Another 1-0 game. Another late, tense night. Another overtime. Calgary had knocked out the Red Wings, not by trying to outshine them, by making them live inside the kind of game Calgary trusted most. That was the shape of the whole run. The Flames did not look like they were playing above themselves. They looked like they had found a formula that kept making stronger teams feel strangely fragile. By then, the city had fully come alive. What became known as the Red Mile was growing with every round. Crowds spilling into the streets, horns sounding, jerseys everywhere, a kind of joyful disbelief spreading across Calgary. That matters because this was not a market watching from a distance. The city felt attached to the team in a very immediate way. The Flames were not just winning games, they were altering the mood of the place. And then came the Western Conference Final against the San Jose Sharks. At that point, Calgary had already proven enough that it could no longer be treated like a fluke. But still, San Jose was good, deep, and dangerous. Once again, though, the Flames started fast. They won the first 2 games on the road, which immediately shifted the weight of the series. San Jose battled back and tied things up, but Calgary never seemed rattled by the pushback. What the Flames kept showing that spring was not perfection, it was steadiness. When they lost, they did not lose themselves. When a game got tense, they did not rush. When a series turned, they stayed with it. That is a hard quality to describe and an even harder one to build, but it was there. Kiprusoff was brilliant again.
Agimla kept leading the way.
Regier punished people. Conroy played big minutes. And then, when the chance came to end the series,
Jelena scored the clinching goal again.
That made him the man who had scored the series-winning goal in each of Calgary's 3 playoff rounds. That is such a strange and beautiful little detail in this story, because it turns him into the perfect figure for what comes later. By the time the Flames reached the Stanley Cup final,
Jelena had become associated with endings,
with final blows, with that one clean moment when a whole series tilts into history. He was already one of the most memorable supporting players of the entire postseason. And now Calgary was going to the Stanley Cup final for the first time since 1989. The opponent was the Tampa Bay Lightning. Tampa had skill, speed, and offensive talent. This was not going to be easy. But Calgary did not enter the final looking frightened or overmatched. The Flames entered looking like themselves, which by then had become a meaningful advantage. Game 1 was in Tampa, and Calgary won it 4-1. That was a strong start in every sense. It gave the Flames the opener, gave them home ice advantage in practical terms, and reinforced the feeling that their style could travel. Calgary did not need the crowd behind it to be effective. The team's whole identity was portable. It could defend anywhere, it could grind anywhere, it could stay calm anywhere. Tampa answered in Game 2, but back in Calgary for Game 3, the Flames won 3-0 and took a 2-1 lead in the series. Suddenly, with the city surging and the building full of noise, the possibility of a Stanley Cup was no longer theoretical. It was close enough to picture. That is where these stories get delicate. When a title starts to become visible, everything changes just a little. The games look the same, but they do not feel the same. Every shift carries more weight. Every bounce seems louder. Every mistake feels like it might last forever. Calgary handled that pressure impressively well for a long time, but by the middle of the final, the whole series had become very tense. Tampa won Game 4 by a score of 1-0, so the series stood at 2 games apiece, and Game 5 in Tampa suddenly felt enormous. One team would come home from it with a chance to win the Stanley Cup in the next game. The other would be trying to survive. It was Calgary that got that chance. Game 5 went to overtime, and Oleg Saprikin scored the winner. The Flames won 3-2 and took a 3-2 lead in the series. They were now 1 win away from the Stanley Cup, and more importantly, that final chance would come at home. That is why the memory of Game 6 remains so powerful. It was not some distant opportunity on the road. It was not some vague sense that Calgary almost got there. The Flames came home with the cup in reach. 1 home win, 1 more strong, narrow, stubborn performance. 1 more night like so many they had already produced that spring. 1 more. The atmosphere in Calgary for Game 6 was exactly what you would imagine. Loud, nervous, hopeful, waiting for release. The Flames were 1 win from their first Stanley Cup since 1989. The Red Mile was alive. The Saddle Dome was full. The whole thing felt as if it was leaning forward. The game itself was not simple. No one scored in the first period, which only added to the tension. Then Tampa Bay struck twice in the second, both goals coming from Brad Richards. That could have been a crushing development, but Calgary answered. Chris Clark scored. Marcus Nielsen scored. The game went to the third period tied 2-2. That score matters because of what came next. This was not some disputed goal in a game that was already swinging wildly. This was a tied hockey game in the third period, with the Stanley Cup sitting in the balance. With under 7 minutes left in regulation, Calgary went on the power play. Then came the play. Oleg Saprikin put the puck toward the net.
Martin Jelena drove in from the side of the crease.
The puck deflected off him and toward the goal line. Nikolai Habibulin was down, scrambling. The puck was near the line, maybe over it, maybe not clearly enough from the available view. The play happened quickly, in a blur of pads and bodies in reaction. No goal was signaled. Play continued. But, almost immediately, the argument began. From one replay angle, especially the one most people in Calgary remember, it looked as though the puck crossed the line before Habibulin pulled it back out with his pad. Other angles were less clear. The problem then and now is that the moment sat right in that cruel space between certainty and belief. There was enough there to make people feel strongly, but not enough to produce an official reversal. In Calgary, though, the feeling was immediate. It was in. That became the phrase. Simple, direct, permanent. It was in. And you can understand why.
Jelena was already the player who kept ending playoff series.
Calgary was on the power play. The building was ready to explode. The puck seemed to cross. It felt, in real time, like the natural ending to the whole run.
Of course it would be Jelena.
Of course it would be a crease goal. Of course the Flames would finally force one over the line and win the cup in the messy, determined, close-range way they had played all spring. Except the goal never came. No red light that mattered. No official signal. No championship. Just continued play. And that, more than anything, is what makes the story so haunting. If the Flames had simply lost Game 6 cleanly, it would still be remembered as a painful near miss. But this gave the game, and the season, a suspended feeling. It was as if Calgary and its fans had already stepped emotionally into one version of history for a split second, and then had to step back out of it and keep watching. Sports usually do not leave room for that kind of half-memory. This one did. The game went to overtime, and in overtime, the emotional balance had clearly shifted. That does not mean Calgary stopped playing well, or that one non-call explains everything that came after. Hockey is too complicated for that, but still, it is hard not to feel the mood change in the story right there. One moment seemed like it might have finished everything. Instead, the game kept moving. Then, just 33 seconds into double overtime, Martin St-Louis scored for Tampa Bay. Instead of celebrating a Stanley Cup at home, the Flames were leaving the ice with the series tied 3-3. That is one of the sharpest turns in modern playoff hockey. From possible champions to one more flight, one more game, one more desperate chance. And now the whole story had to go back to Tampa for Game 7. There is something especially hard about Game 7 losses that come after a moment like that. When a team loses a series in 6, the heartbreak is usually gathered into one night. When it loses in 7 after believing it might have already won in 6, the pain stretches out. The team has to live with it overnight, travel with it, carry it into another arena, and somehow reset itself. The Flames tried. Game 7 was close, as so many games in that run had been. Tampa got 2 goals from Ruslan Fedotenko and built a 2-0 lead. Calgary kept pushing. Craig Conroy scored on the power play in the third to make it 2-1. From there, the Flames pressed for the equalizer. They had chances. They came forward. The season was still alive. Barely, but alive. And then time ran out. Tampa Bay won the Stanley Cup. Calgary's run was over. On paper, that is the ending. But emotionally, of course, it wasn't. Because the 2004 Calgary Flames are remembered for much more than the fact that they lost in 7 games. They are remembered for what they became. They are remembered for ending the playoff drought, for Kiprusoff arriving and changing the whole feel of the team, for Iginla leading like a true star, for knocking out Vancouver, for suffocating Detroit, for getting past San Jose,
for Jelena scoring one huge goal after another,
for the Red Mile filling with life, for a city falling in love with a team that felt tough, plain-spoken, and earned, and above all, They are remembered for one puck near one goal line. That is the image that stayed. Over time, the moment only became more fixed in hockey memory. It was discussed again and again. It became part of Calgary sports identity. It helped feed changes in the way goals were reviewed in later years, with better camera placement and better angles around the net. But none of that changed the result. None of it gave the Flames the goal. None of it gave them the cup. So the season remains in that unusual place where a team can be celebrated and mourned at the same time. That is part of what makes sports stories like this last so long. A championship settles everything in a bright, clean way. A near championship like this one does something different. It keeps a question alive. What if that goal counts? What if the puck is seen more clearly? What if one signal changes? What if the Flames lift the cup right there at home? And because there is no answer, the story keeps breathing. There is another layer to it too. These were the last NHL playoffs before the lost 2004 to 2005 season. There was no immediate next year to soften the memory, no training camp a few months later, no quick return in October. The game, and that disputed non-goal, sat in place for a long time. The whole league paused. For Calgary, that meant the ache had even more time to harden into legend. So when people look back on that team now, they do not just see a finalist. They see a team that changed the city for a while, a team that played with complete clarity about what it was, a team that kept finding one more answer, a team that very nearly completed one of the great underdog runs of its era. And when they think of the ending, they do not just think of defeat. They think of uncertainty. They think of a puck sliding toward a line.
They think of Jelena at the crease.
They think of a building that was ready to erupt. They think of a championship that seemed to exist for an instant, then vanished back into argument. That is why the 2004 Calgary Flames still feel different from a lot of other teams that came close. Most near-miss stories become softer with time. This one never fully did. It stayed sharp. It stayed specific. It stayed tied to one moment that refuses to settle all the way into the past. And yet, there is something beautiful in that too. Because even without the cup, that team gave Calgary one of its great sporting springs. It gave the city belief, noise, joy, memory, and one of the most vivid playoff identities any team has had in recent decades. It gave fans a run that still feels alive when they tell it, not because it ended perfectly, but because it mattered so deeply. Maybe that is the quiet strength of this story. The Flames did not finish with the trophy. They did not get the clean ending. They did not get history to behave neatly, but they got something that only a few teams ever really get. They became unforgettable, and for one spring, they made it feel as if grit and timing and belief might be enough to carry a team all the way through the impossible. They came within inches. They came within one call. They came within one moment that still lives in hockey memory 20 years later. And that is why the 2004 Calgary Flames are still remembered, not just as a team that lost the Stanley Cup final, but as a team that came so close to winning it that the ending still feels unfinished. Thank you for spending some time here. I hope you enjoyed this look back at the 2004 Calgary Flames and at one of hockey's most unforgettable almost championships. Whenever you'd like to come back for another story, I'd be very happy to have you here.